Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Environmental Social Justice. Today we have our returning guest, Mr. John Mirisch. He is a council member of the City of Beverly Hills. So thank you so much for coming back. We have a little bit of a different format today. So today we're going to be talking about our current housing crisis and what exactly that means for the state of California, particularly Southern California. So I've already introduced John. I'm going to introduce Joy Langford. Joy is actually working for Assemblywoman Autumn Burke as her senior environmental advisor. And Joel Vendette is an experienced real estate agent in Southern California and has firsthand experience with the housing crisis and what that means. So, John, I will let you start off with what your opinion is on the housing crisis, specifically referencing our rezoning questions. So, please.
Well, let's first define what kind of a housing crisis we have. Um, I think it's more, if you're going to talk at all about a crisis rather than a challenge, I think it's more appropriate to talk about an affordable housing crisis. In fact, when it comes to market rate and luxury housing, there's not a crisis at all. There are, according to the US Census, 1.2 million vacant units in California. Now, a lot of these are owned by investors who are simply waiting to get the highest return. To give you one example, and then I'll let it go to the panel, of what I'm talking about, the SCAG region, the Southern California Association of Governments, which is most of the state. It's over 20 million people, includes LA, Orange, Imperial, all of the Southern California counties except for basically San Diego. So it's about 20 million people. Over the last RHNA cycle, which is the Regional Housing Needs Allocation or assessment, is we exceeded as a whole the market rate production goals by 30%. Now, when it came to affordable housing, we were woefully below the targets. And so to me, that's an indication of the fact that in terms of the way we're planning things and in terms of the way we're trying to achieve the kind of housing that we need, we're not doing a good job. And there are some people who think that, well, if you just go on and continue to build more market rate housing and deregulate the market, that eventually these units will trickle down, a very Reaganomic way of looking at things, and create affordability. And yet in the real estate industry, we see that that's not the way it works at all. So we should properly be talking about an affordable housing crisis, and we need to be trying to solve the right problem, which is affordable housing, not housing on the whole. And then when people talk about being pro-housing or anti-housing or that sort of thing, again, what we also often ignore, there's much talk about supply side, which again goes back to the sort of Reaganomic paradigm. Oh, we'll just build enough supply and it'll trickle down and a rising tide floats all boats. And that may be true unless you don't have a boat. And so we're not looking also at the demand. What kind of housing do people want? And housing is a very personal choice. How people live, it's a lifestyle choice. And it's a lifestyle choice that people make that is in some cases highly personal, like many others. And from my perspective, we need to be tolerant, just as tolerant of people's other, as we should be about people's lifestyle choices when it comes to a lot of other things. We should be extremely tolerant about people's lifestyle choices when it comes to housing, and we should offer a wide variety of options. And from my perspective, that variety of options absolutely includes very dense neighborhoods. I'm very actually agnostic on density. If people like that, they should live in Manhattan style density. But that said, there are some people who like living in single family neighborhoods, and there is nothing wrong with that. That's all part of, I would say, a pro-housing pluralism way of looking at things. And unfortunately, the dialogue has gotten such that people in many cases are trying to force density on people. And to me, that feels very ideological. It's almost as if someone, we have freedom of religion, and it's great if someone believes in a certain religion. But once they start trying to force other people to adhere to their religion of choice, there's a problem. And I feel there's an issue of tolerance that we are not talking about. And we can and should talk about it here if anyone's interested. Thank you.
Sure. And I fully agree with, having your personal choices and having your freedom of choices. So Joel, I'll let you first comment on that with respect to your background in real estate and what you see.
I would actually agree. I think that the big issue that we have right now is, well, first of all, I don't think we know from a layman's term what defines affordable housing. Everybody, that those buzzwords have been used so much, but I think a lot of people are just going, well, what's that dollar sign? What does affordable housing actually mean when it comes to?
So there are technical definitions. It has to do with a certain percentage of the median household income in areas, and that sort of thing.
Usually a third of household income.
Right.
Which if people are unemployed, a third of nothing means nothing. They need free housing more so than affordable housing, which is another issue and another topic that we can.
Agreed. All these issues go together because it's not just the cost of housing. It's okay. If I have kids, I got to pay for their schooling. I have to put food on the table. I got to pay for gas because we don't really have the best infrastructure to get around. I've got to pay for my insurance. All of these items come together. So it's not just looking at, in my opinion, I understand the mathematical equation to say it shouldn't be more than X amount of somebody's pay is what you should be paying. But a lot of times that doesn't allow to save for a future thing, which then can impact your availability to afford housing. So we have this whole spiral that we've created over generations. And I think we're starting to really see the repercussions of that, in my opinion.
And I would say there are two factors that go into that spiral. One is this role that we have of so-called superstar cities, and the people who believe in something called agglomeration. It's not just that, compared with the 1800s in agrarian America, more people are moving into cities. The notion is that people should all move into the Bay Area or Southern California or that sort of thing. And so what we see is an over-concentration of opportunity. That actually is not, from an environmental perspective, a very good thing at all. And I look to Sweden, which is a country that I'm also a citizen of, where there is an actual attempt by the government that not everyone should live in Stockholm, which is small by comparison to some of our cities, or Gothenburg or Malmo, that it should be spread out. And of course, today, where we have the proof of concept of remote work, we should be looking to that more than ever to offer people more opportunities, to deconcentrate opportunity from the superstar cities, which I would say are in some ways metastasizing, and offer people more choices about where they can live throughout the country and create other urban areas. Again, we tend to, when we say an urban area, we forget that a town like Dayton, Ohio, or Toledo, that those are urban areas as well. We just think of New York or San Francisco or the Bay Area or LA. And I think that is a fundamental problem. And, that's one of the reasons that the spiral is created. And another one is, someone in real estate, you will certainly be aware of the role that private equity and global capital and Wall Street is now playing when it comes to housing. And I think that's another issue that we should be discussing, because I think in many cases their role, yes, it serves to increase property values, but that's not always a good thing when it means that fewer and fewer people can become homeowners. From my perspective, our goal as a country and as a state should be to encourage home ownership. And we should actually, it's a good thing if we can try and encourage those who want to own a home to be able to do so. And that becomes increasingly impossible when first-time potential homeowners are bidding against global capital or Wall Street or REITs or an algorithm. People just can't compete. And I think that's one of the problems, because as we know, home ownership is certainly a way to establish intergenerational wealth and stability. And that kind of stability, from my perspective, is something that is absolutely intrinsic to the concept of sustainability. And I think I maybe mentioned it on the previous show. You think of it, the word stability and the concept is literally embedded in the word sustainability. And I believe they are connected. And I think there's a difference between stasis and stability. But America, and I guess you could say in general, the capitalistic system, is something that has been focused on continual growth. And I think we have to take a step back and think of my country persons, Greta Thunberg, who once said very correctly, and I find myself quoting her a lot when she said that, she said, "Here we are at the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth." So we should take a step back and focus on that, I think.
I actually want to focus on something that you said during that, which is giving people who want to have the choice to purchase. Not everybody wants to own a home.
Yep.
Some people want to rent. And I think that's another issue we have to look at, which is the properties that are being built. We have such an emphasis right now on luxury. And, so the vast majority of properties are coming out. They're luxury because they obtain a higher price point.
Yep.
But the trade-off for that is, or the reason, I think a lot of the reason behind that is because of what it costs to actually build something. So when you start looking at the land, to the infrastructure, just to the lumber or the materials, the carrying costs that go involved, all these things have to be offset at the later point, because no one, anybody who's looking to build, it's a business. Respect that. You want to get a return on your investment. So how can we make it so that people can actually afford to build things that aren't quote unquote luxury?
Well, I would take issue with one thing, that not everyone who wants to build is a for-profit company. I think we have to remember the role that mission-driven nonprofits have, and maybe we forget them, and that's part of the problem. And we see the role that they play in other countries as well. They are competing. Mission-driven nonprofits' goal is to create housing that is affordable to people. In some cases, as Joy mentioned, maybe even completely subsidized. And yeah, she disappeared.
Well, yeah, I texted her. Her internet went down, so she got booted off. The Joy's being live, so she's trying to get her internet back up. So we'll see what happens.
But Joy made a very good point, and so I think what we need to be doing right now, and you're correct, is we need to allow almost a level playing field. Right now, mission-driven nonprofits are competing with for-profit developers for land, for lumber, and for labor as well. And of course, that does drive things up. And again, you're talking about real estate as a business, and I recognize that it is, but I also think housing itself, we're always talking about housing as a human right. Well, we need to then in some ways separate that. And we need to separate that in the way that we do other kinds of things, whether it's healthcare or education. And welcome back, Joy.
Thanks. The beauties of internet. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, and by the way, internet and broadband infrastructure and everything is key, because that will allow people to do more remote work and to allow a deconcentration of opportunity. But this notion that we have to look to the market to create affordability is almost counter to what the market does. There are people who compare housing to pork bellies or to eggs or whatever. But, unless you're very specific, you probably don't care what brand of bacon you get, as long as it's, maybe some people like applewood or cherrywood. But there is a huge difference between making a decision to live where you live, as we all know location is important, and how we live. A small to mid-size apartment of the kind that some of the upzoners are saying we should all be living in is not the choice of many people. It may be the choice of some, and as said, we should respect that. But let's face it. I mean, we know, and we'll come to this maybe in a minute, that there is a homeownership gap when it comes to racial equations. That 70%, something like that, of white people are homeowners, and it's only 44% of black people. I don't think that's by choice. And so even if we're saying that 70% of Americans, and I would think it's more, I think that there are people who are renting who would like to maybe be a homeowner, but for whatever reasons can't. I'm guessing that right now, where we have 70% homeownership, including the people who are renting now and who would like to be homeowners, is probably closer to 80% plus. That said, of course, we need to have robust protections in place for renters. And, that's one thing that I've been very supportive of in our city. We had kind of ridiculous rent stabilization policies in Beverly Hills. The landlords could raise rents up to 10% each year. That wasn't helping people who were on fixed incomes. We fixed that. We took we took measures to severely to be fair about it. On the other hand, I recognize that the corporatization of rental housing is a problem too. And so I'd like for us to be able to ensure that there are more mom and pop landlords, because it's easier for them to establish a connection with their tenants. Now, I'll just say there are some very bad mom and pop landlords. We've seen them. But I think in general, they're preferable to corporate ownership. And I do feel that we should almost be limiting corporate ownership the way that we have anti-hoarding provisions. And at the very least, we should have transparency laws, because there are shell corporations about, who owns housing, and many times people have no idea who actually owns them. We should have transparency so that people can see who the real owners are. And from my perspective, as said, we should be limiting Wall Street and private equity involvement in specifically housing. Commercial is a very different issue, I would say. But when it comes to housing, again, if it's a human right, then housing is primarily for living in, and it's not primarily an investment vehicle. And we have to change our way of thinking of things.
So let me interject real quick before I hop over to Joy on her opinion with the social justice, environmental justice aspect. Talking about mom and pop landlords, I fully agree with full transparency, large corporations that kind of hoard the housing, but this has been a very difficult 2 years for those small landlords that rely on their income from rent because of COVID and the moratorium. So a lot of those mom and pops are going out of business or are forced to sell to these corporations.
Right.
And then talking about generational wealth with being able to buy a home and transfer that to your children, that's very difficult for lower income families with how unaffordable real estate is. So Joy, if you could jump in, just what you see day to day from your constituents, what are you seeing with the environmental and social injustice of this aspect?
Well, you look in impoverished neighborhoods where they are doing massive regentrification.
Right.
And it comes down to who's got the money. So if a big project comes up, a big piece of land, community organizations have typically not been by way of being a community organization, have been able to take down large deals, or even better, to develop them. We've got land crises all over, with even big mall owners and operators like Simons and Westfield moving out of the mall space. So there's going to be a lot of regentrification, a lot of redevelopment in the near future, so that the landowners can survive and remake themselves, as well as the people who live in these communities. So I think we're going to have some real problems due to the fact that income isn't there. There's only so much COVID relief to go around. In the last 2 weeks, they've announced $300 extra per month per child, which might help somebody who has, a large amount of children. But what is that also going to do for the rental market?
It makes a big difference.
It makes a big difference, especially in impoverished areas. But if there's not going to be enough, viable rental housing in that area, people are going to have to move into other areas, and even at $300 a month extra, and not being able to qualify based on your credit or anything else that a landlord does, it's not going to really help the situation. So I really see the gap widening right now on so many different levels. And as a mom and pop landlord myself of quite a few units here in Los Angeles, 2 properties right now, I'm actually in the process of doing ADUs, additional dwelling units. Nicer neighborhoods, the community HOAs are kind of up in arms because, they don't want extra units behind, regular housing. They want to keep the exclusivity of the neighborhood. But yet at the same time, I see that there's a need for housing in these areas. A lot of people would like an ADU or a back house, so to say. But you get constant pressure all the way around from everybody. Your neighbor, people who are having trouble finding housing, the big developers that don't know how to exactly redevelop their property without gentrification. I just see the gaps in the big gaps in communication, making this a harder situation.
And Joy, when you were down, or when the internet was down, I was talking about the need for more subsidized housing, and that is something where I believe the state has failed us. The state is, they talk a good game, but they don't walk the walk. They're trying to force things on cities without providing funding. Well, the state has a budget surplus now of $80 billion or something like that. The state eliminated redevelopment. Redevelopment was a tax increment finance plan to allow for affordable housing and other things. Now, it was abused in certain cases. It should have been reformed to focus on affordable housing. But the fact of the matter is the $300 may not be enough for people. And in some cases, like other countries do, we're going to need to have affordable housing. And what I talked about when you were off was the role of mission-driven nonprofits, who themselves are competing against for-profit developers who are gentrifying and looking for a maximum return on investment. We need to create policies to at least allow a level playing field. And I would argue we need to create, and I've written about it, I think I forwarded an article to you about it, about anti-speculation housing policies. This notion that rising property values are anything that are the only thing that homeowners care about. Actually not true, because upzoning would make their properties indisputably worth a lot more. I think there are cases where the goal has to be community stability rather than just this continual speculation that fuels growth, that fuels more speculation. It's a never-ending cycle and it's a treadmill, and we're not hamsters, and we need to get off of it. So I think community-based solutions are what we need. We need to work with community-based nonprofits who can do the kind of affordable housing, and in some cases it's completely social housing, but the kind that fits in with the community, and they know their communities. It's basically what I'm suggesting is community solutions as opposed to top-down prescriptions or dictating from Sacramento or other places. And we also need to think of infrastructure as well. To me, ADUs are actually a pretty good way of allowing a community to maintain its DNA, but also to add certain the kind of housing that people may want. But there should probably be also subsidies for that as well, because there are things that make it expensive. There are other things that can be done. I've suggested locally, unfortunately didn't get support from the rest of the council, something called a COPA, which there exists in other cities, which is a Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. So if there is a commercial or a landlord, a residential landlord selling a property, the neighbors or the people who live there would have the opportunity to purchase the building themselves and to turn it into a co-op or condos. Now, in many cases, they can't afford it. So there should be funding mechanisms to allow them to acquire that equity. I think you have that kind of a law in Washington, D.C. But again, it needs to be backed up with funding. And this is kind of the thing is, instead of bailing out banks and hedge funds and the sort of things that we've been spending trillions of dollars bailing out, how about bailing out or helping real people who are struggling, in some cases who have had historical disadvantages, and allowing them to join the ranks of homeowners? To me, that would be money better spent than bailing out corporations and hoping that it somehow trickles down. As said, I think that's why I would suggest actually that some of these anti-speculation housing policies that I suggested, which include limiting corporate ownership of residential housing, limiting foreign global capital ownership. Now, again, if someone is not an American citizen and wants to buy a house or a home to live in here, regardless of their immigration status, that's fine. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about global capital. I'm talking about parking money, global corporations and entities parking money in Californian and American real estate. And in some cases, by the way, laundering money, because there's no better place to launder it. And of course, that drives up the prices and leads to gentrification and speculation, where you have people holding on to empty condos because they're just parking their money. They don't necessarily need, in that case, to get an ROI. So these are things that we should be doing. Also, I would suggest anti-flipping rules. Now, if you don't want to ban them, then, as said, for me, if housing is a human right, then homes are for living in primarily. And if you have someone who gains equity and intergenerational wealth by living in a home, by fulfilling the function that a home is built for, that's very different than someone who purchases a home just as an opportunity to flip it and make money. So maybe you tax the person who flips a house at a much higher level than the people who've actually been living in their homes. There are any number of these potential anti-speculation policies. You can look at anti-hoarding rules, at antitrust rules. But from my perspective, you know, there was a very interesting report from Strategic Actions for a Just Economy called Beyond Wall Street Landlords. And the subtitle, I'll just read it, says it all. How private equity in the rental market makes housing unaffordable, unstable, and unhealthy. And these are things that we need to think of and that we should. And, you know, all of the discussion of upzoning does just the opposite. It fuels speculation. It invites global capital to come in and to keep units vacant or to create luxury housing. And one more thing about luxury and market rate housing, and we know this from something called a Nexus study, and it's very logical. You know, and I can give you an example. In Beverly Hills, the council just approved a 340 unit luxury condo project, a $4 billion project.
Is that the old Macy's site or
the old Robinson's May?
Yeah, Robinson's May, yeah.
And get this, the average price of a unit is going to be $11.5 million. Now, that's not for Beverly Hills residents who are empty nesters who downsize, at least most of them, because 50% of Beverly Hills residents are already renters. And the median household income in Beverly Hills is $104,000. They're not people who can afford $11.5 million condos. There may be a few, but most can't. Those are people who are going to have second homes and third homes and fourth homes. Now, I voted against the project because I felt that it didn't do enough for affordable housing. I felt that the ultra-rich owners who are purchasing these condos should pay an additional 2% to go into a fund to help us build affordable housing. And the rest of the council wasn't even willing to discuss that. But my point now is at the time that we considered it as a council, they had not done something called the Nexus study. And I asked them to do it, and the results are astounding. So think about it. Those people who purchase $11.5 million condos, they go to Starbucks, they, you know, get their clothes laundered, they get their shoes shined, and all of the people providing those services for them need a place to live. So logically, when you build luxury housing and or market rate housing, that generates an incremental need for affordable housing. So we had Kaiser Marston, who ran all the other numbers on this project for the city, do the Nexus study. And the Nexus study said that these 340 units of luxury condos would generate an additional and incremental need of 527 affordable housing units, below market units, of which half would be very low income. So by permitting this project, it's not going to trickle down to anybody. It's actually digging the affordable housing home deeper. And this is something that when people talk about upzoning, no one is willing to consider. And it's in some ways, it's a Ponzi scheme. And that's, I believe, something that we need to look at. And as said, that's why anti-speculation housing policies, I believe, could slow down this speculation that is being fueled by more and more by the demand of Wall Street and private equity to have ever increasing amounts of profit, which are actually harming people who are looking for housing.
So Joel,
John, have you seen more homeless in Beverly Hills? You know, that's one thing I don't feel that the state is doing much about. You know, you see the homeless encampments in Venice, but if someone doesn't answer this call and make affordable housing as well as mental health services, which is a whole nother issue.
Don't forget.
Yeah.
Well, and I would suggest that the notion of permitting these luxury condos at a time of increasing homelessness is, you know, take a picture of a homeless tent outside a new empty luxury condo building, and that's kind of a symbol of the problem. Now, you know, obviously homelessness is an issue connected also with housing, but as you correctly say, it's also connected with mental health issues. You know, allowing and permitting more market rate housing is not the solution. And I find it not only fraudulent, but I find it very almost offensive when people say, well, we don't build enough housing, so housing of all kinds is what we need, and look at the homeless. Because there's a very specific remedy to that, and that is building first shelters, then transitional housing, and maybe in some cases taking a housing first perspective, but there need to be supportive services, and that's all about money. And again, that's about making the funding available to build housing to get people off the streets. And if there are people who feel that some of those kinds of housing are carceral, that they don't have their freedom, we need to deal with those issues. But there, the notion of upzoning somehow being connected with homelessness is, as said, from my perspective, not only absurd, it's offensive, because you're taking a serious problem and a tragedy and you're trying to turn it into some sort of narrative to allow for more profits of the urban growth machine. And, that's what we have in place. There is an urban growth machine in place that is simply looking to continue to grow and grow forever. And to me, again, the notion of growth, a spiral of growth that continues on forever, is the definition of unsustainability.
So real quick, just to hop in, Joy, to quickly answer your question, there is an uptick in homelessness in Beverly Hills. I live south of Wilshire, which is not the luxury housing, it's more the condensed housing. And there is a lot more homelessness. We have a lot more theft happening. We have a lot more people breaking into homes and cars. Joel, I know you have quite a few comments, so we're at our 30-minute mark. I want you to close out with what you see as a realtor with respect to the corporate housing, the large corporations buying up this housing, in comment to what John was talking about.
I don't really have too much of an opinion on that one, to be perfectly honest with you, because I do think that there is trying to find the balance between what we have here, which is a free market society, as well as trying to regulate that at the same time, is the double-edged sword that we are living in. And that again, I've said this before on numerous episodes, we have created this problem in the story. We just have. And this past year exacerbated everything, from the people who are unfortunately lost their jobs and can't afford to pay rent. The eviction moratorium saved them. There are so many people that are actually working full time that are about to be evicted. They don't make enough money. So it's like, we have such bigger issues. I mean, every single one of these issues are intertwined, from cost of living to salary to what it takes to live, to where you can work. When you're talking about remote work, I think that's a great idea if the company is going to allow it. If not, you're now unemployed. You've got to find a job somewhere else. All these things are interconnected, and so, yeah.
Joel, you mentioned if the company's going to allow it. And as said, I think there needs to be more corporate responsibility. And we do live in a free market system, but when it runs amok and it gets out of whack, then I feel personally that regulation is actually in some cases okay. If people are not
arguing against that. I'm not arguing against that.
No,
I think that is actually a good thing as well. But I think it's like, this has been going on for so long. This is nothing new. This didn't just spring up over the past couple of years. Like going, oh wait, we got a crisis. Like, this has been ongoing, and all of a sudden people go, oh, we got to get involved. It's like, where were you 10, 20 years ago when this was starting? Where was everybody getting in to put measures in place that could have protected us from hitting the levels that we're seeing now? I remember when there was that fire on the 405 many years ago. Best headline encapsulated that for me, which was, there was a fire. It went up the hills on the 405. It was started by homeless encampment at the bottom and was impacting $1 million homes at the top. The article I saw said, welcome to the second coming of the Gilded Age. And I'm like, so where we're at now is nothing new. Nobody should be surprised that we're in this situation, because it's been staring at, we just had blinders on. When it comes to flipping, I don't see a problem with flippers personally, because I'm just going to dance around that one really quick. And the reason that I say that, I see the smirk. The reason that I say that is because not everybody can afford to buy a home and fix it. People who are working full-time job, maybe 1 or 2 jobs, plus they've got kids, they can't afford to buy a home and then invest money into it and manage that while paying rent somewhere else. So I understand, that flippers have created, there are really good flippers out there, and there are people that are just slapping lipstick on a pig. That's just,
But isn't that something that, I mean, there were fair housing rules in the 60s that tried to, for example, encourage Black home ownership. And as detailed by Keeanga-Yamada Taylor and Race for Profit, they were completely exploited by the real estate industry and banks. And I get it, you're a realtor, and it's interesting because I've had discussions with the LA Board of Realtors. They're very well aware of the role that the industry played, and they're
the government played a role in this. I mean, it's not just realtors; it was the government that did it as well.
It was, but I have the book here. The subtitle, it's called "How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Homeownership." And yes, the government was absolutely complicit. They were working. They were sort of doing the bidding of them, as unfortunately as we know, moneyed interests play a role. But the fact is, at least the theory of some of those programs were to allow for the very kind of situations that you say where people don't have the ability to fix up homes, would be to provide credits and the ability of people to do that, so that it isn't just a matter of flip. At the high end that may be one thing, but we're talking about at the lower end where people were then priced out of the market. And
are you talking about like PACE home loans, which have caused people to lose their homes?
No, I'm talking about programs
are not always great.
No, I'm talking about programs that they designed in the 60s and 70s specifically, under even, the Nixon era and before. And, the book details about how they were, to try and get people to home ownership. There was something called predatory inclusivity, that there was this predation that was predicated upon their being able to own houses. What we need to do is a virtuous kind of inclusivity that will allow people, and again, through credits and that sort of thing. So I agree with you. This is on sort of us collectively. But when you have the state government and the governor vetoing a bill, SB 5, that would have provided several $1 billion a year for affordable housing, and not, or when the state eliminated redevelopment and didn't replace it with anything else, they're basically saying we'll leave the unfettered market to do its job. And again, the market is doing what the market is going to do, and that's to try and create profits and to try and create the maximum amount of profits possible. But what I'm suggesting is that's toxic in some ways when it comes to housing. And so there need to be reasonable controls. And again, these anti-speculation housing policies I'm suggesting represent for me a course correction that would allow the market in some ways to cool down. And this is the interesting thing, is because you always have homeowners being painted as NIMBYs who are only protecting their home values. I know a lot of homeowners who would be fine with the market cooling down like this with these anti-speculation policies, which mean actually their home values would be worth less than they would under upzoning. So you have a group of people who are actually going against their own financial interests for the sake of stability, for the sake of community. And I think that's actually a good thing. It's really the other side, the upzoners, who are just looking for these continual, as Greta Thunberg says, fairy tales of eternal economic growth. And I think we need to take a step back and cool things down. In addition to which, as said, I think this notion of superstar cities is something as a country we need to rethink, because I don't think you're helping the people in Dayton, Ohio by building housing in the Bay Area or here so they can all move here. I think there are people who love their communities throughout the country who need to have opportunity. And in some cases, we have the ability to provide them with opportunity now through remote work. As you say, that's kind of up to the corporations, but we should be looking to do a carrot and a stick approach, as they do in other countries, to allow there to be economic balance, geographic equity throughout the country, which we don't really see now. You've got some of these upzoners who are saying the Bay Area, which now has 7 million people, should ultimately have between 20 and 40 million people. And I just don't think that's a sustainable or a healthy development. And I don't think it's good for anybody.
I mean, I agree on everyone's side. I mean, I'm trying to play moderator and stay as neutral as possible, which is very difficult for me. I believe in every community needs to do what's right for your community. But since we are hitting at the 40-minute mark, John, I would love to have you come back in September if we can continue this, because
sure,
there is so much to discuss, so many sides. I mean, the comment section, Rich, I love you, but we're not talking, I mean, some people get handouts, yes, but we're talking about people that really work hard and have just had bad luck. And Lee with flippers playing capital gains. Yeah, there is a capital gains situation. So there's much more to unpack here. Joy, I will give you the closing statement because you've been so patient, and I know that you have a lot to say.
Well, no, I think that we're going to see a whole lot going on in a short amount of time, especially with the rent moratoriums and seeing how the job market goes, as well as how COVID goes. This is going to be a conversation that's going to keep giving. So, with that, I would just say I look forward to speaking to John again as we learn more about what's going on with the world and the economy and how we're going to get through this thing.
Absolutely. So on that, guys, thank you so much. This has been a huge amount of information for everyone to kind of digest over the day. And look forward to John coming back, hopefully come September, and we'll continue this discussion. And hello, Chester in the background.
Yes.
Thanks so much. Look forward
Take
to
care,
it.
guys.
Bye now.
Bye.